Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Miriam Wagner. I am the Executive Director of the Wolf Institute in Cambridge. Thank you very much for joining us again at one of our webinars. This is a webinar that is run jointly by the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean and the Wolf Institute with a lot of partners, and I have to read those because there are a lot of partners that support this endeavor: the CSIC IMF, the University of Munich, the Medieval Studies Research Group at the University of Lincoln, Ghent University, the University of Exeter, and the University of Edinburgh. Many of you in the audience, I've seen quite a few of the familiar names, but those who aren't familiar with the webinars, I'll quickly introduce the two main host institutions. The Wolf Institute is a research institute in Cambridge. We focus on religion and society, and we combine our research with teaching, with public engagement, and with policy work. Please have a look at our website, have a look at our YouTube channel to find out more about our work. And now with my other hat on, the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean was founded in 1997. It's dedicated to all aspects of the academic study of cross-cultural Mediterranean history from the 5th to the 15th centuries. And this is the moment where I always introduce our journal, the Institute Journal Al-Masakt. This beautiful journal, thick journal with most fantastic, fascinating articles, comes as part of the subscription for the membership for the society. So please consider joining the society and receiving our journal 3 times a year. A very quick introduction how the webinar works. We have a Zoom webinar audience. We are also live streaming via the Society Facebook page. So if you want to rewatch it or if you want to recommend it to anyone to watch, it will be very soon available on our YouTube channel, on the Wolf Institute YouTube channel, and also you can watch it, rewatch it on Facebook. Our theme for today is Medieval Mediterranean Central and Peripheral Authority in the Medieval Mediterranean. And our chair is Dr. Gregory Lippiatt from the University of Exeter. He will introduce our speakers very shortly. And after hearing their short presentations, you can then type any questions you have into the Q&A portal, which is at the bottom of your screen. Please type them in the Q&A portal rather than in the chat, because it makes it much easier for the chair to handle and process the questions. We will end, as always, at 6 o'clock sharp, but you're most welcome to stay for a more informal discussion afterwards. So we often have a few more questions, 10, 15 minutes. So please feel free to join that as well. And now is the right time to hand over to the chair. So Gregory, over to you.
Thank you very much, Miriam. And thank you all very much for coming. It's a great pleasure to be chairing this session with 3 really fantastic speakers talking about different areas in this really dynamic space of the medieval Mediterranean and the ways in which power is expressed in the center and in the peripheries. To begin with, we have Professor Damian Smith from St. Louis University. Damian is a great expert on the medieval crown of Aragon in the 12th and 13th centuries. Numerous publications, too many to list here, but chiefly I'll just draw attention to his 2 monographs. The first one, which I found especially helpful in my research, is about Innocent III and papal policy in the crown of Aragon. It's called Innocent III and the Crown of Aragon, The Limits of Papal Authority. And his more recent one is Crusade, Heresy, and Inquisition in the Lands of the Crown of Aragon, circa 1167 to 1276. It's a great pleasure to have Damian with us today, and he will be speaking to us about the Aragonese noble revolt of 1226 to 7 and royal authority. So over to you, Damian.
Thank you very much, Gregory, for having invited me here. It's a great pleasure. I hope people will bear with me in that I'm slightly unused to this format. I'm just going to talk about research I was doing at the moment on the Aragonese revolt from 1226 to 7. A revolt of the Aragonese nobles from summer 1226 to spring 1227. Pedro de Aragonese, a hero of the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, and a papal counselor, was killed by one of the king's men and this lit the touch paper for an uprising of the Aragonese nobles and cities, which contested the authority of the king until a treaty was signed at Alcalá del Obispo on the 31st of March, 1227. Now, we have a narrative account of this revolt from the king himself, from James the Conqueror, composed half a century after the events in the 1270s, when the king looked back on his youth and this special moment when he saw himself as establishing his authority over the nobles, nobles whom he always distrusted, whom he never really understood. He memorably advised his son-in-law, Alfonso X of Castile, that if you have to choose, you should always try to keep the church and the towns on your side rather than the nobles, because there are none so faithless as knights. Of the historians who have dealt with this revolt, the great Catalan historian Ferran Soldevila tended to trust the king's account quite readily, while Luis González Antón was rather dismissive of the king while trusting in archival sources. I think the events didn't pan out quite as the king suggested, but it was, however, a significant moment for Aragon and a significant moment for the Western Mediterranean. Talking very briefly here, the Aragonese nobles had very long-term grievances and mounting frustration with the direction of the territorial ambitions of the crown of Aragon. Through the union with the Counts of Barcelona in 1137, then because of the rise of the Almohads in 1157, rather than the preferred southern frontier, they found themselves sucked into the politics of the Midi of France. And a path should have opened up for them through victory over the Almohads at Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212. But the death of the Aragonese king, Peter II, in 1213, fighting versus the Albigensian Crusaders, meant the accession of the 5-year-old King James, as well as a 10-year truce with the Almohads at a time when the Almohads were militarily very weak. This was frustrating for the nobles. It was frustrating for the cities as well. The young king's authority was very weak, and we can see this especially when it comes to questions of fighting. One might think that when the king had a truce, then none of his people can fight. But this wasn't always the case, and there were ways around this, particularly for the military orders as supranational organizations. And while there was generally cooperation between the military orders and Spanish kings, at this time the Order of Santiago pursued campaigns versus the Almohads against the king's wishes, and with the king embarrassingly overruled by the Pope, who was his overlord. As well as those who fought when the king didn't want them to, there were those who would not fight when the king did want them to. As the king grew a little older and attempted to besiege rebel nobles in their castles, he found that many of those who were on campaign with him did little to help him or indeed to help the other side. And also there were those who, when summoned, did not turn up at all. After the truce with the Almohads ended in 1224, and the king sought to take up the cross to attack the barbarian nations, the king's first crusade failed through a lack of support and proved so embarrassing that he decided to leave it out of his great memoirs altogether. And in 1226, something similar happened. The king, by his own account, planned a raid into the kingdom of Valencia and summoned his nobles to Teruel. most of them didn't turn up, and so James agreed a truce with the Muslim governor of Valencia, Abu Zaid. And then returning, James met Pedro de Aragonese on the road, going with 60 knights alongside his brother, the Bishop of Zaragoza, to the land of the Moors. And James told Pedro there was now a truce in place, but Pedro said that he and his brother had spent a lot of money on their campaign, and they were going to go ahead regardless of what the king said. James then said this was an affront to his lordship. He sought to take Pedro prisoner, and Pedro was killed while beating retreat. This led to pacts and confederations made by the Aragonese nobles, leading churchmen, and the cities, all following this, airing every grievance possible concerning the upheaval in the kingdom, the failure of public order, the diminution of their laws, and the imposition of unjust taxes. And James had no doubt that nearly everybody at this point was against him. But while there appeared to be every possibility that this conflict would then escalate, and there was indeed some fighting, and there were people who were killed at this moment, the Aragonese held back from blaming the king directly for all their ills, or held back from taking him on directly. And through the good offices of the Archbishop of Tarragona and the Master of the Templars, the Treaty agreed Alcalá was a compromise, really, rather than a triumph of the king, in which the recent leagues and confederations were dissolved. James assigned the knight's fees to various of the leading Aragonese nobles, and both sides dropped any claim to damages. Now, importantly here for James is that James did not lose outright, and therefore he could take this as a win. And the moment seems significant for two reasons. Firstly, looking back, James saw this as the moment when his understanding of his kingship developed, since he was the king of Aragon, and he held the kingdom by right, and those who came against him did what they ought not to do, then God must help him as king. And at this very same moment, an increasing number of young lawyers, mainly Catalans, we know who they all were because they were students, and they took out student loans, and so we have record of this. All these guys coming fresh from Bologna were arguing for the king's divine charge to give justice and reason to those who could not find either, as well his capacity to interpret doubts in the law for the various princeps to make what was doubtful clear and certain. And secondly, what was also clear and certain was that any attempt then to continue the Valencian conquest just at that moment was unlikely to succeed. The support was simply not there, and James needed a new direction. And obligingly, within no time, and after a little provocation, the Almohad Wali of Mallorca, Abu Yahya, attacked the Catalan ports and stole one of James's boats. And with this, casus belli provided James with support mainly from the Catalan nobles and various Catalan and Occitan towns, undertook the conquest of Mallorca in 1229, and then, of course, with much added prestige, the conquest of Valencia, with Valencia city taken in 1238. And in both kingdoms, his lawyers could then helped James achieve a greater authority than he could possibly then acquire in the kingdom of Aragon itself. So that's what I wrote.
Thanks very much, Damian. That's really interesting to see the interplay there. And I have lots of questions and points there, but we will move on first to our second speaker, Dr. Philippa Byrne, who is an assistant professor at Trinity College, Dublin. Philippa is a great expert on intellectual and legal history and the moral theology of law. Her book, Justice and Mercy, Moral Theology and the Exercise of Law in 12th Century England, is really fantastic. I can't recommend it highly enough. It really helped shape the way I think about some of the intellectual currents that are going on, not just in England, but in the academic world of the late 12th century more generally. It's a really fine book. But Philippa's also turned her attention to the Mediterranean in recent years and has done a project on Sicily. And that's where she's going to be taking us today as we look at the view from Palermo and other views, center and periphery in Norman Sicily. So thank you, Philippa.
Oh, thanks very much. I'm just going to share some, it's basically just some pictures to share with you. So I hope you can all see that. Okay. There we go. Start talking about the view from Palermo with a picture of Palermo. Yeah, the terms sort of centre and periphery, central and peripheral power could keep a historian of Norman Sicily going for centuries, probably longer than the monarchy itself. I really only want to offer some very basic observations. The first is that Norman power in 12th century Sicily was newish in several difficult and important ways, not just dynastically, but in terms of the different territories and groups it attempted to hold together. The nature and intensity of that power, of that lordship, varied, and much recent historiography has addressed this. Let me just list some of the questions that others have asked. For example, how did local communities understand their connection to the centre? How did those at the centre, wherever that is, conceive of this amalgam of territories? Was it a kingdom? Was it an empire? Or was it some other slightly more ambiguous form? And then, of course, how far is it possible to look beyond Palermo? The court centre, the ceremonial centre, and also the apparent political centre. And I really only want to make the very basic point that in a sort of addition to these discussions of lordship and power, and that point is the periphery, I want to talk about the periphery, peripheries, perceived the centre in the terms it knew. In other words, lacking any really coherent explanation of what this Norman power was, observers from the periphery viewed it in terms of the lordship and the rulership they knew best. And that means we need to think more about the intellectual horizons of the periphery itself. So what I want to suggest is that however innovative or not Norman attempts at asserting power might have been, however they reimagined or replaced existing structures, those on the periphery still understood them through their own local or personal terms of reference. That matters particularly when we are often reliant, not exclusively, but often reliant on external perspectives for an account of what's happening in the politics of the kingdom. It also matters particularly when, as is often remarked, the Norman rulers of Sicily don't really cultivate their own sort of in-house historians, and we're often reliant on these peripheral views for that reason. So I just want to talk very briefly about three works from the periphery, no more than little snapshots. So next slide. Let me start with Falco of Benevento. He's probably quite well known, most known of the three at least. So Falco, there is in Benevento, chronicles the kind of unruly expansion of Norman power in southern Italy in the sort of first 4 decades or so of the 12th century. He's watching the Norman kings, though he's absolutely and indignantly not their subject. He's observing them closely and quite nervously. Now, The interesting thing about Falco is that he offers no real sense of Norman power as having a centre or being tied to any centre. He doesn't make any association between Palermo and Norman kingship. He isn't really interested in the ceremonies that modern historians have spent so long on. Norman power for Falco is dangerous because it can hold so many cities at once, or it can rush between them. So Roger II is getting all around Messina, Naples, Capua. They're in danger because of the frightening, even impressive speed that these Norman kings can move with. So it's almost, not quite, but almost a vision of itinerant kingship. Now, in a sense, perhaps that's unsurprising. We know that Roger II was active. He did move around a lot. He was trying to establish power in southern Italy. In that sense, Falco is describing facts. But what's interesting, I think, is that Roger starts to look quite a lot less impressive when we compare him to the central focus of Falco's texts, namely the papacy, the popes. Falco observes papal rulers, and it's from them he takes the lesson that movement is both a normal and necessary kind of requirement for rulers. Innocent II isn't styled as kind of pope in Rome. He's styled as ruler of a constellation of different papal cities and lands, and Innocent II has to get between them. He has to jump on his horse, he has to make a circuit of towns, he has to go and confront his challengers. But for Falco, the point is that rulership is real because it's on the move. If the pope remains in Rome, or he's confined to Rome, then that's essentially a retreat. So Roger II aspires to be a ruler of cities, and he moves between them, but he's not uniquely active here. He's only really, for Falco, kind of mirroring papal activity. So the point is simply this. Falco knows about Roger's power. It's kind of evident and obvious and real, but he imagines it in relation to the power he knows much better and has seen much more closely, papal authority as it exists in early 12th century Italy. That's Falco. The next one briefly to talk about is Richard of San Germano, whose chronicle covers the end of the 12th century kingdom of Sicily and the disruptions that follow it in the 13th century. Richard's inside the kingdom, but at one of its far edges, near Monte Cassino. And indeed, Richard has very close links to the Abbey of Monte Cassino, too many to go into much detail here. And much of his account turns on how Monte Cassino fits in to the kind of historical narrative of the period and its politics. But the point I want to make is that Richard imagines Norman power, the power of William II, the grandson of Roger II, as essentially akin to the power wielded in Monte Cassino by an abbot. William rules in Palermo much as an abbot does in the lands of St. Benedict. Both King of Sicily and Abbot of Monte Cassino have the same obligation to ensure peace in their territories. What does Richard want to tell us about Palermo? He wants to tell us about what William builds there, namely Monreal. He wants to tell us about William's Christian monumental project. So in that sense, we might read William in Richard's telling as a kind of abbot embarking on a new round of building projects, a house for the Lord to honour his office. So in other words, something distinctly abbatial about royal power on this telling. And then finally, last of all, there's perhaps the most complex one. I want to touch very briefly on a poem known as Tristia ex Milito Gaudo. Those who know it will know it's the subject of some quite controversial, critical discussion. I don't want to wade into that. What most people would agree on, it's a poem written around the middle of the 12th century by an exile from the Norman court, probably on Malta, though a little bit disputed. And the poet's desperate to return to Sicily, desperate for intercession to allow him to be forgiven and to return to the kingdom. What's very strange about this poem is that though this author clearly knows about the way in which the court works, so he's served in the administration, we think, he offers almost no sense of Sicily. We get some classical topoi about its geography, but we don't get any cities on the island, any references to how politics works. Instead, all we get is the person of the king, Roger II. It's an almost entirely personal view of what power is. To approach Roger might be akin to approaching the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. Roger's an absolute ruler. The implication is that he's as overwhelming and powerful as Etna itself. He might swallow everything. But essentially, Sicily is reduced to Roger, or Roger's expanded to all of Sicily. Now, some of this is about poetic license, but some of this description of power is also about what the poet wants. And he makes it clear he wants pardon, forgiveness, the end of his exile. In other words, he needs personal power over any legal or administrative structures. He needs something that could be achieved through a direct address, an appeal to the king, whatever the king might be. So in other words, another text that tells us not about Norman power and its functions at the centre, but about the frames that external observers were reaching for. So let me conclude. My point here is not one about literary genre and style, though of course that matters. Of course, one kind of chronicle looks different from another. Of course, a poem looks different again. Of course, different authors record different events according to their own agenda and interests. But what I'm trying to say is that we have a kind of cumulative intellectual problems here. These three texts, on one hand, can be read as kind of documents of how far the tendrils of Norman power extend. But more significantly, they are local readings, personal readings of a distant power, intermittently experienced, sometimes new, and not always welcome. And they're trying to fit them into different frames of reference. So, in other words, what we have here is the periphery transforming the centre. And indeed, even more than that, each periphery is transforming the centre in its own way. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Philippa. That's really, really interesting. I like that framing very much. Next we have Nathan Websdale, who's a very exciting doctoral student at the University of Oxford at Wolfson College. Nathan is working on what has been termed, Nathan may take exception to this, I don't actually know, but what has been termed a sort of centrifugal tendency in Byzantine politics towards the end of the 12th and early 13th centuries, as provincial regions of the empire start to look away from Constantinople and towards more local identity. His thesis is titled, and please forgive my butchering of the Greek here, but Panspermia and the Romoiai, Performative Ethnicity and the Weaponization of Space in Byzantium's Post-Imperial Networks, 1200 to 1230. And Nathan is particularly interested in the what will later be known as the Despotate of Epiros. And so Nathan will be talking to us today about pull up the title here, Rebuilding Rome, Yet Unbecoming Roman, Epiros and the Fragmentation of Byzantium after the Fourth Crusade in 1204. So thank you very much, Nathan.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And thank you to the organizers for putting on this event. It's a real privilege to be here and share the stage with some very accomplished speakers. I will be contextualizing things at the beginning because the Byzantine history is not always on the curriculum for many students or the general public. So let's make a start. So the topic of this introductory paper, I'm just going to minimize that screen so everyone can see everything. There you go. Topic of this introductory paper is the state known to history as Epiros and its process of state formation and the authority it had both to claim and defend. Epiros was a successor state born out of the Fourth Crusade of 1204. And this is the period when the Eastern Roman Empire, which is here in the yellow, which has been born out of the Roman Empire of antiquity, transforms itself and is transformed into something more resembling a fragmented patchwork. It is the period after the Fourth Crusade when a Catholic army set out to recover Jerusalem from the Mamluk Sultanate were instead diverted to Constantinople by Venice. And in the course of a rejected attempt to place a puppet emperor on the throne, the Venetians conquered the capital city and partitioned what was left of the Greek Orthodox Roman Empire of Byzantium. Byzantium, therefore, being the half of the Roman Empire that did not fall, Epiros is therefore something of a successor state of a successor state, and was one of several heirs to this multi-layered socio-political tradition that reached back to classical antiquity, but operated in the fractured world of the 13th century. And originally founded as a center of Orthodox resistance to the Crusaders, Epiros far outlasted this original purpose, and it established itself in different forms as a monarchy ruled by Byzantine Greek, Italian, and Albanian dynasties. After nearly 2.5 centuries of autonomy, Epiros, or Epiros, like all other Byzantine fragments, as well as the various kingdoms of the Balkans, were annexed by the Ottoman Empire with the final conquest of its capital city of Arta, down here in the mid-15th century. My own work on Byzantium, as Gregory so kindly introduced, is both broader than and yet typified by Epiros. I started my thesis at Oxford focused on the use and rhetoric of ethnicity and space in the time of the Fourth Crusade. and this is a highly charged period. From 1180 onwards, the Byzantine world witnessed tremendous fragmentation, in almost all cases permanent. As dynastic instability rippled out into political divisions, often states would form along ethno-linguistic lines. In the key cases here, you can see of Bulgaria and Serbia. There are also Armenian and Albanian principalities that are steadily crystallizing into monarchies, and all these peoples that have been integrated into the Byzantine world for centuries are now seeking independence. It is a period when the state and church that had once prided itself on embracing multiple languages and rendering Christianity intelligible to all, regardless of mother tongue, is on the decline. It is when Byzantine imperial legitimacy and power was challenged both by internal and external threats. And yet, in its own language and its source material, often blurs the lines of what was and wasn't the in-group from the out-group. There is a very ill-defined us versus them when no one seems to know quite who to trust anymore. And traditional borders of language, Greek, which the Byzantines often called Romaika, language of the Romans, and religion, Christian Greek Orthodoxy, were becoming no longer criteria of distinction. There were many Greek-speaking states that opposed any restored imperial government, and there were many Christian Orthodox powers who sought their own archbishops, even patriarchates, as the cultural sphere of Byzantium rapidly unraveled. And the study of Epiros is particularly interesting because it is never really considered by mainstream narratives of history to be of particular importance or legitimacy. In the fallout of the Fourth Crusade, the first state to crown itself Roman Empire of the Byzantine tradition is Nicaea. It is also the one that is ultimately successful. And it means that when Nicaea rebuilds the structure of the church and have a coronation and the impression of a semi-legitimate successor state, they tend to be seen as the only state. And we have challenged this in recent years. A number of theses and books have come out which sort of start saying this is what they want us to believe, but we're still not listening enough to the other voices. Because Nicaea is typified by two real things. It's typified by ethno-linguistic divisions, which is the idea that the Roman language or the Greek language or the Hellenic language, and all these terms are being used, are how we define ourselves from them. And it is a sign that linguistic otherness should often be rejected. As you can see here, the emperor of Nicaea on the right says, how can the Persian ever help the Greek? How can the Italians or the Bulgarians ever rejoin us? How can the Serb not be suppress the Serb, as he writes it here? These are terms not that would have been used before in an earlier age of commonality. Now, the second prime element of the Empire of Nicaea and the idea of a strict continuity between Constantinople and Nicaea that must be very much challenged is that the idea that after they have reconquered Constantinople, they are rewriting history to say they've always been the only state that was ever really in contention to reform Byzantium. But this was not the case. For 30 years after 1204, Nicaea was not the polity leading the fight against the Latins, nor was it the largest. Epiros was. Epiros led the resistance and reformed a semblance of Byzantine control. By 1224, the annexation of Thessaloniki, they proclaimed themselves emperors of the Romans and undertook several truly interesting yet understudied phenomena. Where Epiros ruled, it relied upon a generation of reappointed bishops, trained in pre-1204 Roman law, to attempt to rebuild imperial law and governance. And they also tried something else that flew in the face of all current trends. They were spearheaded by the development of cults. One was that their ruler, Theodore Komnenos Doukas, who was crowned emperor, should be dubbed a demagogue, and he should be judged a new Moses, a savior of the fallen Christian people, and that people would bind themselves to him with oaths. They would swear oaths to the sole Christian emperor without referencing the ethnonyms of division. He was just simply to be, in the oaths that circulated across all the churches of his state, emperor of the Christians. And they could have no other. The other major development was of a cult of one Saint Clement. My words there? Yes, there. Clement was a disciple of Saint Cyril and Methodius, the apostles to the Slavs, who had invented a written language for the non-Greek speakers as part of their conversion to imperial Greek Orthodoxy in the 9th century. I'm just going to move my name in case I'm thinking anything. In the context of the 13th century, how a Byzantine state could re-engage with non-Greek speakers and attempt to re-establish a broader state were incredibly relevant issues. Clement himself was by then the patron saint of the city of Ohrid, here circled in modern-day northern Macedonia, and one of the most beautiful cities in the Balkans. And it was idea that Clement, this idea of coming to a place and rebuilding and transmitting languages and texts and heritage through different languages, could reform some sort of multilingual society. What we have surviving from this time of Epirot hegemony is new narratives of hagiography as well as liturgies, which survive in manuscript form, praising both Theodore and the saint with the same term of demagogue and new Moses. And it gives the sense that in addition to these, with the establishment of local synods, the retained appointments of Bulgarian clergy, marriages into Albanian, Serbian, and Bulgarian families, and the employment of legal precedent and fair application of law, there was an attempt, ultimately unsuccessful, to rebuild a multi-ethnic society of the Byzantine Balkans. And they did this because they lacked a major distinction to their power. The Epirites were never more numerous nor more wealthy. They were trying to gain something through a reinvestment to unify power through what was shared in the Byzantine tradition. And ultimately, this is all very dependent upon military victories, and it unravels very quickly. Because as mentioned several times, Epiros is not the main narrative to Byzantine history. That belongs to its rivals. And so my research looks heavily at the reception and legacy that the state, under question here, receives from its larger and more powerful rivals. And it is very rarely positive. Lacking a name for a Greek-speaking rival empire, the Epirites are often reduced to being called Bulgarians. But nothing is consistent. Theodore, the emperor, is rendered to be a Bulgarian, but at the same time, people surrounding him and serving him will be Greeks because they still want to bring them back down and rebuild that Greek-speaking state. And there are many references to all sides in this conflict having a great deal of cultural heritage that is shared, and that there are references to the land still being called, like pre-1204 Byzantium, Romania, a land of the Romans, where there are many different peoples within that. Because who the Romans were is not a narrative that is ever resolved. Bulgarians, Serbians, and finally the Ottoman Turks all eventually imagine themselves as heirs to a Roman Empire. Because Roman and its meanings has, as is well discussed by historiography, evolved over the course of the Byzantine millennium and been inherited in many different ways by many different peoples. And this could, in certain contexts, mean something broader than a single ethnic group. An element to factor in is to understand the potential damage, the linguistic exclusivity that was being done by the ultimately successful states caused to the idea of rebuilding the Balkans, and how it isolated them eventually from their neighbors and their former co-Romans. So a little bit about what we're doing at Oxford and what precisely it is that I'm trying to accomplish. And so here is a very lovely fresco of an unnamed and definitely had his name removed saint that is, emperor that is painted on a wall in North Macedonia. That is most likely Theodore Komnenos Doukas. So we are trying then since 2023 to build an internationally collaborative research initiative operating under the name of Epiros the Western Rome. We convene panels at several congresses as well as a 2-day workshop that connects multiple international centers in order to facilitate a new series of studies on the Western Balkans. The core territories of the Epirot state are inherited by multiple modern-day countries, and we try to reflect this. It has also caused research to be very sporadic. We are frequently using editions from Tsarist Russia. Therefore, in a new forthcoming book, we are envisioning as a companion to the Epirot state, we are proposing a new understanding of the political ideology of the state, of its cultural networks, of how it understood power and authority, as well as a translation and commentary to key materials, so that the Epirot Roman Empire and its nuanced and complex relationships with its neighbors can finally receive the attention they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathan. That's really, really, really interesting and great to hear more about that, the project at Oxford. Can everyone hear me? I pointed about unmuting, but good. Okay. Right. So I have lots of questions, and I see there are already some questions in the Q&A chat. As Miriam said at the beginning, please feed your questions into the Q&A, and I can then read them out to the speakers and take any follow-ups there. It's easier to use than the chat. I suppose if I could maybe take chair's privilege and just start. I thought the intellectual framing that Philippa provided was a really interesting one and applied to the three papers in various ways that I wondered if I could maybe bring them together very briefly. So Damian, you talked about how the James's response to this rebellion really kind of shapes his understanding of his kingship going forward. I was wondering if we look at that from the other direction, to what extent is Pedro Jimenez just behaving the way knights expect they should? Is this a change also in the way that power is exercised in the Crown of Aragon, and that the knights are in fact taken aback because this is what they expect is normal? Not that they're asserting necessarily new rights or trying to push back against the crown, but rather the crown is changing the terms on which it understands its relationship with the aristocracy. And so I was wondering what you might think about that. Shall I do all three and we can, everybody can go in turn, or do you want to do one by one?
I can answer.
Okay, yeah, you answer, and then I'll ask Philippa, and then I'll ask Nick.
Yeah, it's a very good point. It's a changing relationship, a change in the development of the authority of the king. An authority is being developed through the lawyers who are coming out of Bologna. And the Aragonese, the Catalans as well, are having to deal with a new situation where their customary rights are being challenged. So it's an important moment all around. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Philippa, I was really taken with this idea of thinking about how the periphery can change, how the periphery shapes perhaps local, but certainly historiographical perceptions of the center. But it also struck me that there's an inherent power imbalance here, especially in a kingdom like Sicily, which is very centralized. So I wondered what you think about, is the ability of the periphery to shape the center limited to its historiographical impact in the way that it records relationships with the center, or does it have a real effect on the way that the center behaves? Do views from Monte Cassino or wherever looking towards, or Malta, looking towards Palermo or wherever the center might be, are they able to actually shape the center, or are they just able to shape the way that the center is interpreted in their localities or through the sources? Does that distinction make sense?
It's a good question. Whether I can answer it is a different question. I mean, I think clearly there's a historiographical complexity to this, but in terms of beyond writing things up, beyond what survives, how the periphery might, I don't know, fight back against the center. I suppose, take a very bland answer, I suppose it depends what kind of center we're talking about. And if we imagine a Norman kingdom, at least as one where what's happening is, very broadly speaking, Norman kings may be sitting waiting for things to be brought to them, which they can then approve. If they essentially just, one model, come in as the kind of top rung of that ladder to either say yes or say no, here are my autonomous communities who are running things as maybe they have always done or have done for a long time. It's just that you've inserted Norman kings in the top, then peripheries have quite a lot of opportunities to shape how all this works. It's just they need that stamp of approval that means you are essentially now part of a centralized, in inverted commas, monarchy. I think the interesting test for Norman Sicily is what happens at the moment of the dissolution of the monarchy, when, as it were, you get Henry VI coming in, and here's a moment to kind of reckon with something which, call itself a kingdom. Does it look like any kingdom you've encountered before? Do you have to try and reimagine this anew? So yeah, I think I think it depends. The person who's sitting in Palermo or wherever royal power happens to be concentrated at that particular moment, how far they think they can push things, or indeed how how bothered they are about central power as something which is rhetorical versus central power as something which you've got an administrator in every village or town.
That's really interesting. It makes me think of Tom Smith's work on the papacy and the sort of responsive government of the papacy in the same period. Well, same period and a little bit later. Yeah, and how the papacy is actually, I mean, again, can be seen in some ways as being very centralized, lots of peripheries, right? All of Western Christendom, and yet seems to largely be stamping the stuff that's coming in. The business is being set by the peripheries and then coming into the center. And given what you said about Falco and his understanding of Norman kingship through this papal lens, there's a lot. Yeah, very, very interesting. Nathan, I think the thing that I've been increasingly impressed by is just how contingent our understanding, and this is you've laid all this out in your talk about how contingent our understanding of Epirus's role is based on knowing how the story ends, right? If you're going to put your money on a winner in the 1220s, it's not going to be Nicaea, it's going to be Epirus. And that seems to be very closely linked to this universalizing language you're seeing amongst the Ducoi, the way that they talk about claims to power. And that, it seemed to me, militates somewhat against the centrifugal tendency narrative, right? That there is, even though we're out there on the fringes, there is still this very firm belief in Rome, in the role of Constantinople, the role of universal empireship. This may be an unfair question in the same way that perhaps the question to Philippa was unfair, because I don't know what our sources allow us to see. But to what extent do you think the way in which Theodore Ducas is talking about universal authority reflects the concerns of the Epirots, and reflects the understanding of the Epirots and their place within the empire or outside of the empire? And how much is it an opportunistic grab by someone who is frankly Constantinopolitan anyway, and just happens to be out on the periphery, making a bid from his sort of satellite state to that universal authority? To what extent is this about, to what extent do the Epirots get lost in the mix here because they just happen to be a bit that survives and has a powerful ruler ruling over them that can make these kinds of claims? And how much do they really buy into this universal identity?
It's a good question. And how long does any of this last is definitely a very, very crucial part of this, because in the historiographical and in the long duration look at this, the hegemony of this 10-year period is a flash in the pan. It's not to be reclaimed, really. The idea about how long this political legitimacy and how long this idea of we're actually still rebuilding something here. I've been toying with the idea for a while that a lot of how the Epirot state imagines itself is definitely inherited after them by the Bulgarians. And that's why they become seen as the Bulgarians before them. And that the Aecinid state, which ends up being very much taken apart by the Mongol invasion in the 1240s, has tried to pick up on these things and put itself as more of a rival, and more of a consistent other, very much conglomerate empire, which is going to rival Nicaea. And that's how this sort of amalgamation and conflation of peoples in later historiography starts to depict the Epirots. Because asking for how much of this worldly Epirot view survives, I think it survives in Ohrid. I think it survives amongst their manuscripts. They are still using these liturgical prayers up until the 16th century, when we have started them rewritten again. And the manuscript criteria here is quite interesting, because they are going back to the time when they were an independent kingdom, and then finding all these various sermons and prayers and bringing them forth again. But we cannot really know, as we're lacking a very strong chronicle for Epirus, and this is where we are hampered by source material. The only narrative history we have for Epirus is much later. We have a hagiography for an empress, and we have a chronicle of a very, very local church, which records all this with tremendous errors. So we do lack that that voice to say about, how genuine is all of this.
Thanks very much. Thanks. Okay. Well, thank you also to our audience for indulging me in asking the first round of questions. Again, please do throw your questions in the chat. We have one there from Silvio Lorenzo Roberto, who is a question for Philippa. And he's asking whether you might expand a bit, if possible, on how Palermo itself became the political center after the first Norman stronghold of Troina, the courtly and episcopal see of Messina, and Adelazia's San Marco d'Alunzio's court. In short, what informed these geographical shifts? So how do we move from these, my Sicilian history is a bit patchy here, but how do we move from these more peripheral centers into the center at Palermo?
It's a good question. There are probably people in the audience who might well be better placed to answer this than me, but let me give it a go. I think, I mean, one of the problems here, if we think about sort of the sources we take to try to explain this shift, or why we end up with Palermo as the center, is that you think about the narratives of the conquest of Sicily produced by the Normans, around the turn of the 11th, 12th century. If you read them, pushing towards Palermo all the time, the narrative you get is that Palermo was always a target. Palermo is the thing that you're traipsing through this horrible Sicilian countryside full of tarantulas because you want to get to Palermo. It takes several goes, but this is the place you want to get to. There are scenes where they arrive at Palermo and they can see it from the outside, and it's surrounded by these beautiful, lush, fertile groves. So, according to these texts, of course, that's the place you're going for, you're heading for all the time. Harder to unpack that. I think there's a kind of a point here about what the Normans are, calling them Normans, of course they're not all Normans, what these conquerors, invaders are learning about the past and how they're thinking about ceremony. And there's certainly an argument to be made. You can make it from archaeology, but you can make it from what also goes on in the early decades of the 12th century, that Palermo is already seen as a kind of stage on which kings or rulers of any sort should be kind of parading themselves. So this is set up for a high and mighty kind of vision of lordly power. Of course, they're not kings at this point, but they have aspirations. So Palermo is set up for that. I suppose the other basic point that's worth making is in terms of the kind of economy of this too, and the kind of the geography of it. Palermo is in many ways well positioned for supplies coming in, but also as a kind of place where you can take all those citrus fruits and sugar canes that are being grown further inland or in the lands around Palermo and ship them out. So I think it's meeting multiple functions. The kind of interesting question is how much do these conquerors in the early 12th century know, or how much do they think they know about what Palermo's been in the past? What one would really like to know as well is what's the view from Syracuse? We just don't know. But here's another place which could make big claims to having an important and profound antique past that gets passed over. So those would be my considerations. I'm not sure if that quite answers the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Again, please do continue to put your questions in the Q&A box. Philippa, I suppose one thing that strikes me there is how much both Syracuse and Palermo are oriented towards the wider Mediterranean, and not towards Italy, which is interesting if you think about where the Normans are coming from. They're not seeing Messina as a kind of linchpin to hold the island and the mainland together. They're facing out towards the west.
Yeah.
Which is I don't know what that means. I just think it's interesting.
Yeah, I'm thinking about those again, back to those kind of early Norman histories, epic poems, as it were. Messina, as far as I can recall, it's just a place you transit through.
Yeah.
You've got to go through Messina because no offense to any people from Messina or the ones, but you've got to get past Messina because there are things waiting for you on the Italian mainland. Broadly speaking, I think across the 12th century, Messina doesn't get a great write-up in any kind of historical narrative that I can think of. Again, end of the Norman regime, it makes the play for a kind of asserting its associations with the new German rulers of Sicily. Messina is kind of keen to get in there, but its primacy isn't written into these texts.
Yeah,
that way.
That's very interesting. Damian, I wondered if I could come back to you on a point. I'm very interested in this for my own because it kind of it marries with my own interests, I suppose. But the way in which these nobles see themselves as kind of having the right to wage war on their own behalf. And so when we see Pedro Jimenez coming, deciding, well, I want to go and fight the Moors, and so I'm going to, regardless of whether you have a truce or not. The first thing that put me in mind of is the behavior of the French Crusaders in 1212 on the Las Navas campaign, where they come across areas that have signed peace with the Spanish kings, and they decide, well, we're going to attack anyway. Does that? I wonder what you think. Does that tell us anything about? Because I suppose the way that's often interpreted is, here's these outsiders from France who come in. They don't, like you often hear about the Holy Land as well. They come into this multicultural context. They don't understand it, and they just want to kind of to get their fists bloody. But the event in 1226 suggests something a little bit different, which is that the Spanish nobles aren't immune to this either. This is perhaps less about French versus Spanish and more about just how nobles and the economy of aristocratic violence. I mean, what do you think? I mean, how do you see? Is that a fair comparison to make, or are they very different?
Yeah, it's probably a different scenario here, but it's clearly the case that there are nobles and bishops who are strongly disinclined to follow the king's truces and to fight anyway. That from the king's point of view, everybody is bound by the truce, but that's not how it's seen by some of the nobles, and it's not also seen at times by the military orders as well, which is a particularly interesting case where normally the military orders cooperate with the king, but here we have an occasion where the most central authority, the papacy, will at times overrule the kings to have the military orders fighting when the kings are not. Sometimes the kings want that, of course. Sometimes this is particularly the case with Alfonso VIII of Castile, that he wants them, the Calatravans, to fight when he's got a truce. No, it's a slightly different situation. The Arna's case is sort of seen as a particularly tragic one because he was actually the closest advisor of the young king, and he's probably resentful that he's fallen out of favor and that other nobles have taken his place.
That leads me on to another question I was thinking about during your talk about the military orders. When we see military orders who want to keep fighting despite truces, or being told by the Pope to keep fighting despite truces, is it Iberian-specific military orders who do that, or are the Templars and the Hospitallers doing it as well, or is it just
no,
the
as I might be wrong on this, but as far as I'm aware, from what I've looked at, it's the Calatravans and the Santiagans who will be encouraged to fight by the papacy, and at times will carry on fighting those two. But I could be mistaken on that. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I'm going to hand over very quickly to Jessica now, because we're going to come to the end of the recorded session. A big thank you. You can stay on, but there'll be more discussion afterwards. But a big thank you to the Wolf Institute and to the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to all those who've attended. And Jessica, over to you.
Thanks very much, Gregory. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. We're going to end the recording now, but as Gregory says, you can hang around and ask some more questions. This is just the end of the formal part of the webinar. Thank you all very much for coming, and keep an eye on our social media and your emails to find out when our next webinar is, which will be later in March. Thanks very much.